Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving into pay equity, which, well, it's a hot topic for a lot of HR folks out
It
there.
really is.
It can get complicated, so how do we even approach this in a way that ensures our compensation practices are fair?
It's definitely a journey, not a quick fix.
Right.
And the best place to start, I'd say, a solid compensation philosophy.
Okay, so can we break that down a bit? What exactly is a compensation philosophy, and how does
Right.
that lay the groundwork for pay equity?
Well, you can think of it as like a statement.
Okay,
It guides your organization's approach to compensation,
gotcha.
explains how you determine pay, outlines the criteria that you value most, things like performance, skills, experience, education, that kind of stuff.
So it's like setting the rules of the game,
Right, exactly.
so that there's less room for bias because everyone knows how compensation is determined.
Right.
So how do we actually create a compensation philosophy that, truly supports pay equity?
I think the most important thing is aligning it with your company's mission and values. Like, what does your company actually stand for?
Mm.
Do you want to be known for rewarding high performers
Okay.
or prioritizing internal equity, making sure people in similar roles are paid consistently?
Right, because those could lead to very different pay structures, right?
Exactly. And you also have to think about your industry, your talent acquisition goals.
Yeah.
Do you want to lead the market with really high salaries?
Yeah, to attract top talent
Yeah.
or match the market average.
Right. More balanced approach.
So it's not just some feel-good statement, right?
Yeah.
It actually has real implications for every pay decision you make.
Exactly. It's the foundation.
Okay, so once you have that philosophy in place, you have to figure out how to put it into practice.
Right.
So let's talk about structuring those pay processes.
Yeah.
What are the steps?
Well, the first thing is thorough job analyses. You need to clearly define each role. Responsibilities, the skills they need, experience levels, all of that.
So we're making sure we understand exactly what each role entails.
Exactly. Then you need to gather market data. What are other organizations paying for similar positions?
Right, right. You need to know where you stand.
In your industry, in your region.
Yeah.
And that helps you figure out where you want to be, competitively.
Do you want to be at the top,
Yeah.
middle, maybe even below for
Yep,
some roles?
Exactly.
So let's say you decide you want to target the 50th percentile for a particular role,
Okay.
meaning, you're aiming to pay around the market average.
Yeah.
But to give yourself some flexibility, you establish a salary range.
Okay.
So maybe plus or minus 20%.
Ah, that makes sense. So
Yeah.
you've got a little bit of bandwidth for different levels of experience, maybe performance within that role.
Right. But the key here is consistent application.
Right.
Every pay decision.
Okay.
New hires, promotions, annual reviews, you name it. So we're not just like setting this system and forgetting it. We actually have to, use it actively.
Right.
But then how do we know it's actually working? How do we check the system for fairness?
That's where pay equity analysis comes in.
Okay.
It's crucial to make sure your pay structure is fair and to, catch any discrepancies.
It's like looking under the hood, right?
Exactly.
And before we even start looking at the data, are there things we need to keep in mind?
Absolutely. First and foremost, involve your legal team early.
Legal team, why so early in the process?
Well, because pay equity analyses can have legal implications.
Okay.
You want to make sure you're complying with all the laws and regulations.
Makes sense. What else should we be thinking about?
The specific questions you're trying to answer.
Okay.
Are you looking at pay equity for new hires across departments, different job levels?
So we're setting clear objectives.
Exactly. Now, the data itself, you need to standardize it.
Hmm.
For accurate comparisons, might involve converting all compensation into a single currency, especially if you have, international operations.
Right.
And then applying what's called a logarithmic transformation.
Logarithmic transformation. That sounds a little complicated.
Yeah, it's basically a statistical technique that helps us look at the percentage differences in pay.
Okay.
Removes any distortions caused by, location, currency, job level, things like that.
So we're creating a level playing field.
Exactly. And you also need to think about sample size.
Okay.
Make sure you have enough data points for the analysis to be, statistically sound, especially important for smaller organizations.
Right, where they might not have as much data to work with.
Right.
So even if we're small, we can still take meaningful steps to assess pay equity.
Exactly.
So once we've standardized the data, we've got our questions, what are we actually looking at in the analysis?
Variables.
Variables.
There are three main types to consider.
Yeah.
First, control variables. These are things that should legitimately influence pay.
Yeah.
Job level, performance scores, seniority experience, that kind of stuff.
So factors that our compensation philosophy, already takes into account.
Right. Then you have your independent variable.
Okay.
This is the specific factor you're testing for its impact on pay.
And in this case?
Gender.
Gender. Okay.
And finally, the dependent variable.
Okay.
This is the pay outcome you're actually measuring.
So salary, bonuses.
Exactly.
Okay.
Or a combination of those.
So we're looking to see if there are differences in those outcomes between men and women.
Right. And one way to make those comparisons more meaningful, use pay ratios instead of absolute values.
P ratios. Why are those helpful?
Because they help control for things like, location and currency.
Right.
Those external factors we talked about. So you're really comparing apples to apples.
I see, yeah. This is where it starts to get a little complex, right?
It can be. And that's why it's so important to have someone with statistical expertise involved.
So it's not just like basic calculations.
Yeah, you need someone who can build and clean your data set.
Okay.
Address any missing data, incorrect data,
Makes sense.
and group similar jobs for accurate comparisons.
So the data is reliable and organized in a way that makes sense for this analysis.
Exactly. And then you have to watch out for something called multicollinearity.
Multicollinear.
It's a fancy way of saying that two variables might be so closely related that they can, distort your results.
Okay. So, if tenure and job level are almost always the same, you might only need to look at one of those variables.
Exactly. So you're refining your variables to make sure they're giving you meaningful insights.
Okay.
So once your data's prepped, your variables are chosen, then you can run a regression analysis.
Okay. So let's talk about that next time, because I definitely want to dive into what that means and how we can actually use those results to make changes. But unfortunately, we're out of time for this part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
So we'll pick back up in part 2. Make sure you tune back in.
Definitely.
Welcome back, everyone. We're picking up our conversation about pay equity. Last time, we left off talking about regression analysis, and to be honest, that whole data piece, it can be a little overwhelming.
I know what you mean.
So can you break that down for us a bit?
Sure. So a regression analysis, what it does is it helps us look at the relationship between all those variables.
Okay.
It's a way to see statistically if there's a link between, gender and pay, even after we've considered all those other factors, experience, performance, all that.
Right, so we're not just looking at if men and women are paid differently.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure out if that difference is actually because of gender.
Exactly. And the analysis tells us if that difference is statistically significant, which means it's, unlikely to have happened just by chance.
Okay.
And if we do find gaps, we can figure out how big they are and which factors are contributing the most.
So let's say we've done all this analysis and we find that there are pay gaps based on gender. What happens next?
Well, the first step is always to bring your legal team back in.
Right, of course.
They can advise you on how to address the findings, legally and properly.
Makes sense. So what are some concrete steps that HR can take to start addressing those inequities?
Well, we need to look at all our people processes, hiring, performance reviews, promotions, the whole thing.
So it's not just about fixing the numbers. We have to understand the systems and the decisions that might be creating these gaps.
Exactly. It's systemic. Let's start with performance management, for example.
Okay.
Is the system objective? Are there any biases, even unintentional ones that might be affecting evaluations?
That's a good point. Those little biases can really add up over time, can't they?
Absolutely. And it's not just individual biases either. Think about who's making the decisions about raises, promotions, bonuses. What criteria are they using?
Yeah.
Is there transparency? Are we holding people accountable for making fair decisions?
We're really looking at the whole picture here. Are there any examples, of companies who have addressed this well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about Google, for instance.
Okay.
Back in 2010, they realized that women engineers weren't putting themselves forward for promotions as often as men.
That's interesting. Any idea why?
It could be a lot of things.
Yeah.
Cultural expectations, lack of confidence, maybe not enough mentorship. But the result was a pretty big difference in promotion rates.
What did they do?
They were very open about it.
Okay.
First, they shared the data with everyone.
Wow.
Sometimes just making people aware of the issue can have a big impact.
Right.
And then they started encouraging everyone to nominate themselves for promotion. And they really emphasized the manager's role in supporting their team members.
So they tried to shift the culture, Make sure everyone had equal opportunities.
Exactly. And by holding managers accountable, giving them clear guidance, they were actually able to reduce that gap.
That's encouraging. A lot of companies might be hesitant to share that kind of data.
I think so too, but that transparency was key.
So let's say we've identified some gaps.
Hmm.
Is adjusting salaries something we should consider?
It's definitely an option, but it has to be strategic and it has to fit with your compensation philosophy, you know?
Right, right.
If there's a gap you can't explain any other way, a one-time adjustment might be what you need to even things out.
But it sounds like it's about fixing the current problem and also preventing it from happening again.
Exactly, it's both.
That's
Salesforce is a great example.
okay.
In 2015, they found a gender pay gap. So they committed to making adjustments to bring salaries into alignment, but they knew that was just the beginning.
So what else did they do?
They addressed the root causes, they looked at their processes, their systems. They've done a lot of things to promote pay equity since then.
So it's a two-pronged approach. Fix the immediate problem and create a system that's fair in the long run.
Exactly. And it's important to remember this is ongoing. It takes commitment from everyone, from leadership to individual managers.
It can't just be an HR initiative.
Right, it has to be part of the culture. And that means holding people accountable.
We've talked about managers, but how do we ensure they're making fair decisions?
Education.
Okay.
Make sure managers understand what pay equity is, how bias can creep in, how their decisions are a part of the solution.
So raise awareness, give them the tools and knowledge they need?
Right. And then build accountability into the system.
How so?
Make sure managers know that their decisions will be reviewed.
Okay.
Share data with them, show them how their team's compensation stacks up.
So transparency is really key.
It is. You could even create internal committees to review the data regularly. Adds another layer of oversight.
So it's about making this everyone's responsibility, not just HR's problem.
Exactly. And when employees feel like they're treated fairly and they have a voice in the process, that makes for a much better work environment.
Absolutely. This has been so insightful. It's clear that HR has a big role to play in making pay equity happen. But what about individual employees?
Yep.
What can they do? How can they advocate for themselves and their colleagues? I think that's a great place to pick up in the final part of our deep dive.
Definitely.
Welcome back to our deep dive on pay equity. We've talked about the organization's role, HR's role, all of that. But before we wrap up, I want to talk about individual employees. What can they do?
It's a great point. Organizations need to build fair systems, but employees can advocate for themselves too.
So what are some practical things employees can do?
Well, first, knowledge is power, right?
Right.
Understand your rights, be aware of the laws. We've got federal laws like the Equal Pay Act, and a lot of states have their own laws too.
And it's not always as simple as having the same job title, right?
It's about being paid fairly for substantially similar work, experience, skills, responsibilities, all of that.
There's a lot to unpack there. Where can employees even start?
The Department of Labor website is a good place. Tons of info on pay equity and workers' rights.
Okay, so do your research, know your rights, don't be afraid to ask questions. What else?
Be proactive during salary negotiations. This is so important.
Yeah.
A lot of people, especially women, they shy away from negotiating. And that can really hurt their earnings in the long run.
It's an ongoing conversation, right? Not just something you do when you first get hired.
Exactly. Promotion, a raise, new opportunity. Be ready to talk about your value.
I think having data is so helpful too.
Absolutely.
Note the salary ranges, gather information about your performance, be prepared to share all of that.
You got it. And remember, negotiating doesn't have to be like a fight. It's about having an open, respectful conversation.
Right, you're advocating for yourself, making sure you're compensated fairly. So we've talked about individual actions. Is there anything employees can do collectively?
Definitely. Employee resource groups can be really powerful.
Especially those focused on women or underrepresented groups.
Exactly. They can provide a space to share information, talk about concerns, and push for change together.
They can work with HR, with leadership, to address those systemic issues we talked about earlier.
Exactly. More transparency around compensation.
It's about like community, collective action.
Right. And it doesn't have to be a formal group.
Yeah.
Just talking openly about pay, sharing salary info, negotiation strategies.
Break down those taboos.
Right, exactly. Build a culture of transparency support. When employees feel empowered, they can really make a difference.
I love that. This has been such a great conversation. We've covered pay equity from every angle.
I agree.
It's complex, but it's something we all need to be working on.
Absolutely. Pay equity is about fairness, but it's also about creating a workplace where everyone can thrive.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Uh,
And that wraps up this episode of The Deep Dive. We hope you found it insightful. Be sure to join us next time as we continue to explore the world of work.